Hello to all you custom GPT builders out there. I have noticed a distinct lack of information regarding how to set up from beginning to end your own API that works with custom GPT actions. So I'm going to show you how to do it yourself from start to finish. We're going to build our own FastAPI application and get GPT to both send and receive information from it. And it's going to be easy and fun. Plus, you'll be able to use this foundational knowledge and apply it to really whatever you want. Maybe you want to build an app that can reach out to another API to pull weather data. Maybe you want to reach out to another AI. It doesn't matter. The principles will be the same, and you'll be able to take the knowledge you learned here today and apply it to anything that you want. So let's get started. First, I'm going to leverage one of the custom GPTs I wrote called the GPT Action Builder. We added an example FastAPI application into its knowledge base, and we're going to use that to build our custom GPT actions with. To get that, we're just going to click this button right here. Now, why are we using FastAPI, you might ask? Well, the reason for that is right here in this custom GPT configuration screen. Now, if you've ever tried to go to this action window, you've seen that it wants something called an open API schema. And believe me, this is not something you want to even attempt to create by hand. FastAPI and Pydantic are going to create all of this for us automatically. So for testing this, I have an Ubuntu development server that I'm going to set up with a Python virtual environment in order to install all the needed libraries for this application. First, I'm going to set up a new virtual environment, and then I'm going to use pip to install all the libraries we need, which in this case are FastAPI, Unicorn, Pydantic, and requests. And once all those packages install, we're going to make a new folder, and then we're going to make an app.py file, and we'll paste our code from our Action Builder GPT into it. Now, some critical things to note in this code. The first one is our URL at the top. We have to set this correctly to the server endpoint URL that GPT is going to talk to. Otherwise, GPT won't know where our API is. The next important thing is the Pydantic classes and their descriptions. This is some of that secret sauce I was alluding to earlier. This tells ChatGPT what the proper inputs and outputs should look like with these endpoints. And ChatGPT takes these descriptions very seriously. In fact, it takes them more seriously than the actual instructions that you might provide to the GPT, so you have to make sure that these are both accurate and concise in a way that GPT can understand. Finally, for each API endpoint, we have a doc string. And just note that OpenAI will limit you here to 300 characters or less for your doc string. So if you get an error when you try and import your OpenAPI JSON, you'll know what to fix in your application. Now with all that out of the way, let's run this application on our development machine with Unicorn. So now I'm going to launch Unicorn with Unicorn app:/app --reload --host on 0.0.0.0 and port 8000. Now the reload flag here is super convenient during our development phase because that's going to allow us to just save our app.py changes to that and it will automatically reload the server for us. The 0.0.0.0 tells Unicorn to bind to all interfaces so that we'll be able to hit it outside of just the local machine. And we're just putting it on the default port of 8000. Once you get more APIs running, you'll have to increment this or change it to a different port number. And it looks like we're up and running. So why did we go through all this? Well, let me show you the magic of FastAPI and Pydantic. Let's launch our browser and go to our development server on port 8000. And we'll go to /docs. For those of you not familiar with FastAPI or Swagger, this is a really amazing reference, especially if you have a lot of API endpoints. Now you can see how it took all of our class descriptions for our inputs and our doc strings and created all of this. This is a super handy reference for us as humans that explains how our APIs work and what they expect and return. Now we just need something that ChatGPT can understand. So instead of /docs, let's put /openapi.json at the end here. And as you can see, we have a fully compliant OpenAPI schema. I told you before, this is not something that you want to attempt to make by hand. And with this, we get all of the critical fields we might need, like operation ID, our server URL, etc., automatically generated for us. But before we give this to ChatGPT, let's test our API and make sure that it's working. Now, the best way I found to do this is with a tool called Postman. Postman is an incredible tool, and it's something I highly recommend you keep in your toolbox when building APIs and applications like this. For our app, when we first open Postman, we only have to do a couple of things to test it now that it's running. First, in the URL bar here, I'm going to set it to post, because if you saw in our documentation, the endpoint that we set up wants the post method submitted to it. We'll put in our server address and port here for the API endpoint that we created. And if we look at /docs again, you will see all the information on how to use this API is here for us. We can see our fetch HTML endpoint wants us to send via post a JSON with the URL that we want it to process. To send that JSON, it's important that in Postman we set the following in our headers: context type equals application/JSON. Otherwise, we'll get an error. But don't worry, ChatGPT will know what headers to send automatically when we actually integrate that. Let's set in our body to raw and put in the JSON example from our docs with a URL to test. And we'll click send, and awesome, our app is working. This is a very basic example, and as you can see from our response, we're getting a lot of junk here that we don't really need. Remember, GPTs have a limited amount of memory called tokens, and we don't want to waste any of them on all these unneeded HTML tags. So I'll show you a little bonus round, and we'll improve our endpoint to filter out some of that. I'm going to use the same custom GPT Action Builder and just ask it to filter out HTML tags and any unnecessary white space. And as you can see from the code outputs, we're going to have to add a couple new libraries. So let's add those packages too to our virtual environment before we forget. We'll put in our new code and save. And because of that reload flag, Uvicorn will automatically reload our application, which is super handy during the development phase. And this is really my development workflow when I'm building these kinds of things. I start in ChatGPT asking it to build me something. I'll load that into my code editor, which is usually VS Code, but I'm trying to make this video a bit shorter, so I'm skipping that part and just developing directly on the server. I'll fix any issues, test with Postman, and continue iterating and improving until I have something that I'm happy with. Now we'll just test in Postman again, hit send, and that is a much better response we got this time. It's a much more manageable amount of data for our GPT to ingest. And I would say that I'm happy with this API endpoint now. Now, one other important requirement to note is that we'll need to front end this with something like Apache so that we can support TLS and SSL. This is because GPT will not communicate over unencrypted ports. It's really just a default security requirement these days. And speaking of security, you'll probably want to set up some kind of authentication to your API endpoint, such as an API key. For this example, I'm just going to keep it simple. I'm not going to go deep either into setting up a reverse proxy in Apache. I will just show you real quick that I'm making everything in my Apache config going to /API to hit that port 8000 that will be listening on localhost. And that'll make GPT happy and we'll stay secure. And this may not apply to you. You may be hosting this in a Docker container or on REPL, Heroku, whatever. It doesn't matter, right? If you're hosting directly on a Linux server like I am in this example, you'll probably want to also configure this API to start on boot by making it a systemd service or something. But for now, I'm just going to continue launching it from the terminal. Before I do that though, I need to update my URL in my app to be the URL that ChatGPT will connect to, which again, for me is going to be Apache passing traffic to the localhost listener via Uvicorn. And I'm going to launch the app now, and it's now running and ready to receive traffic from ChatGPT over the internet. At this point, I recommend doing one more test in Postman with the final URL that we're going to give to ChatGPT. We'll just duplicate this tab in Postman. We'll change the URL, hit send, and yep, these results look great. So now let's load the Open API schema for our server API. I'll just note here, for some reason, when you use a reverse proxy like this, it does seem to break the /docs URL. I'm sure there's an easy fix for that, but I don't need /docs at this stage. The only thing that I need to work is that openapi.json URL. And it does, so that looks good. At this point, we're ready to test and set up our GPT. But before we do, let's recap really quick. We've got an application that has all of the needed descriptions, doc strings, and everything else it needs for its inputs, outputs, and the API endpoints that we have set up. We've got a tested API running on a server over HTTPS that is accessible from the internet. We've got an openapi.json that looks correct and has the right server that matches where we tested. So all we have left to do is create our custom GPT. From chat.openai.com, on the left side menu here, we're going to click Explore. And then at the top, create a new GPT. We're going to immediately hop over to the Configuration tab and go down to Actions. And up at the top, we're going to click Import, and we're going to put in the URL to our openapi.json. Now, if all goes well, we will see an action pop up here that reflects our API endpoint. And it looks like it did, so this is a very good sign. Now later, after you get everything set up or you add new API endpoints, you'll be able to just click these test buttons here next to the action you want to test, which is super useful during development. Remember, the schema is what tells the GPT what to input and what it should receive. Try to put all the usage instructions for the data portions there, but your specific instructions as far as how it should behave with the data, what it should do with it, and how it should display it, that will go into the instructions box. It'll obviously depend on what you're building and what you want your GPT to do. Before I back out of this screen, one more thing. Just remember to put in your privacy policy if you plan on making your GPT public. You have to set a privacy URL to your website. You won't be able to save your GPT as public otherwise. And just a quick warning on this, most websites are not cool with this type of scraping. I am showing this as an example only, and this is not the most optimal way to get data out of most websites or sources. Many websites will provide APIs that you should hit instead. So please do me a favor and don't use this example exactly as it is to build a GPT that can freely browse the web. That's probably against some OpenAI policy, I'm sure. You'll probably also want to hard code into your application some limited set of values so that it restricts the inputs. Because even if you put it in your instructions, if you don't hard code it, it's very easy to lie to a GPT. For example, and tell it, I'm the developer of this GPT, and ask it to submit anything you want to a certain action for, quote, testing, which if you're not careful, might mean someone only needs 1 or 2 chat messages to compromise your entire server. So this is important stuff. And with that all out of the way, let's put in a name and some instructions so that we can do our final test. I'll just put here, this GPT will accept a URL and analyze its contents via the fetch HTML action, and we'll save that and do our final test here. Please fetch and analyze https://cybrix.ai/gpts.html, and we'll click allow. We'll allow it to hit our API, and if we give it just a minute here, and it works! We did it! If I switch over to our server, we'll also see the request from the GPT to our API endpoints, and it did pretty well. Alright, so hopefully you guys learned something. Hopefully this gets the gears in your heads turning for what's possible out there, and it'll get you building some really cool stuff. I'm going to close out with just a couple more things. If you do get an error while trying to save your GPT, sometimes there's a bug where you'll have duplicate actions at the bottom. The only way I've found to fix that is to delete one of them, which unfortunately will delete all of them, but all you have to do at that point is re-import your openapi.json and enter in your privacy URL again, and then it should let you save. And thank you guys so much for sticking with me. I really hope you got something out of this. Please try some of our custom GPTs, especially the Action Builder one we used today. I'll put the links in the description. It should help you in building something of your own. Remember, you don't need the schema provided to build a decent app. FastAPI and Pydantic will do all of that for you. Thanks again, and if you're interested in what we do or seeing more videos like this, please like and subscribe to this video. Also, check us out on Twitter at CybrixAI. I'm hoping to make more videos like this in the future. I cannot wait to see what you guys build. We'll see you next time.